certainly don't want to be the creator of it. I think it needs to be created in a collaborative fashion.
Okay, so this is just the first phase in. We're going to determine what the makeup of that committee should be, and then the ideas are going to start rolling, but the ideas haven't started rolling. In terms of what kind of changes should be taking place in the Navy legislation. Are there any ideas being floated out there right now? Or you don't know?
No, there's no ideas being floated out there right now. I think it's from ground zero. We start looking at taking it apart piece by piece and looking at it from a 25-year-ago perspective to today's perspective, based on what has changed at the state level and what has changed at the local level up until this point. So I think you're starting from ground zero. That's why I think there's a sense of urgency here in case, if we are going to move forward and agree upon something moving forward from a task force perspective and an agreement of all three bodies, then the sooner we start talking about it and meeting on it monthly, the sooner we're able to come to a consensus and have legislation, modified legislation drafted if needed, and get ready for 2018.
Okay. I just wanted two more, please. Thank you. Okay, obviously, good idea. I mean, a conversation is a good thing to have. Task force is a good thing to have. Get this thing rolling, like you say, as soon as possible. There's something else that's sort of a little off to the side, a little bit, that I'm concerned about, that really needs to happen real soon. And Diana Campbell hit on it when she said about there being an assumption to stay in regional lines. There's been a lot of conversation out there, and I'm very concerned about something. I really am. That when we hire people left and right in this district, and when they put in their resumes, we're checking them out. We're making sure we want them for our district. But you know what? They're checking us out too. And they want to know where we stand on certain things, because highly successful people want to come to places where they're going to have high degree of success and a high degree of security in knowing that we're going to be the district that we've always been. Okay? Now the assumption thing, I'd love to see this. I'd love to see some sort of resolution put out there. Put it down on paper that the town of Bristol and the town of Warren get a resolution. We're committed to this school district. So that when anybody applies to this district, I'm very concerned about this, that anybody applies for a job in this district, they just passed a resolution. It says, man, they want this thing to stay together. They're gonna do everything they possibly can to make this thing to continue to work. Because there's been a lot of stuff out there, a lot of talk, and I don't want people chucking us out and say, wait a minute, I'm gonna apply for a job here, 2 years later, it's not gonna exist anymore. We can't have that. So that's one of my suggestions, to do a resolution.
Well, I'll just comment on that real quickly, is that, I believe that we need to be ahead of it. As we all know, words are as dangerous as weapons, and letters to the editors claiming they want to go one way or another can cause as much harm and damage to this regional school district as one bad teacher or one bad administrator or one bad school committee member could, or whatever the case may be. So if we are ahead of it and we start managing the conversation at the public level, I think we'll all be better for it. So I agree with you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for taking the initiative to get this thing going. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ken, thank you for coming out. I like my colleagues on that. So knowing that you mentioned time is of the essence, time is short, is the intention that this joint meeting at the end of the month between the two towns and the school committee, that at that meeting we should have an established task force to come out of that meeting? Is that what you were looking for, so that at the meeting at the end of the month we have the makeup of the task force and it's got boots on the ground and it's running?
That would be my hope.
Okay, and so how long would it take to get the output of that task force and get the legislation drawn up so that it's ready for the, are we going to make the 2018 session? And or if it takes too long to get this thing going, do we have the potential to miss it altogether?
I think the answer is yes to both. So yes, we could get it introduced and done in time if people worked hard enough and put their effort and time and energy into it on a normal basis. And yes, there's a potential of missing the session. But that's not a crisis if we miss the session. Because, you know, you certainly don't want to rush this either. I mean, if it takes longer, then it takes longer. But if we continue to talk about it on a monthly basis at our regular agenda meetings, I personally feel that it's just going to continue to perpetuate and go nowhere and potentially spiral out of control with further letters to the editors, whether pro or con, and ultimately take it out of the control of those that are been entrusted by the people of Bristol and Warren to control. So we don't want people that don't have current knowledge of what's going on at either town or current knowledge of what's going on here in administration at the school department level to be controlling the conversation. We should be controlling the conversation. Not somebody that's outside of the box and doesn't know what's going on and doesn't know the specifics or the exacts. We should be controlling the conversation. That's what we're elected to do. So, you know, I just couldn't take it anymore. That at the end of the day, I respected the space that both towns needed when it came to waiting for the judgment to be ruled. But it's been ruled. I'll move forward. That's my wish, and that's one of my hopes, that at the end of the day that everybody will get on board and will leave yesterday aside and recognize that it's there, but we'll look forward to today and tomorrow.
Kenny, I think you know from the conversations we've had, and whether it's over the years or even more recently, that I believe the regional school district is something that needs to be sustained, and we need to take all the steps necessary to keep it that way. I think both communities benefit. I think the students benefit, and all of those benefits are not necessarily something you can see on paper. There's a lot of intangibles. Like you, well, actually, I should take that back. Not like you. One more than you. I've had 5 children in the system, 4 that have graduated already, and have done so successfully. And so this system has improved in the time I've sat here. There's a couple of things that I feel that we need to say, questions for you, by the way. I listened to Ms. McBride, and while I'll agree that we need many times to have an outside facilitator. Okay, we've done this before at your initiation before, the last time when you were a joint finance committee member. And that task force didn't have an outside facilitator, but had a member who ran those meetings and did a phenomenal job doing it, keeping everyone focused and keeping them on task. The problem I have, and I see it all the time in education, Mario listens to me say this all the time, people in education study everything. It's getting them to do anything that's a problem. Okay, because they never draw a conclusion that you go forward with. And the problem that I saw before is there were suggestions. Enactment of those suggestions didn't take place for years. There were short-term suggestions that were acted on after the short-term had expired, and the long-term suggestions were never acted upon. So I'm not so sure that we actually need a moderator or facilitator as much as we need someone that can gather information and the details and the money to pay that person or that group to provide that information so that that body can actually look at solid things. That's just my view. Going back to what Mr. Bradshaw said, I didn't hear you give an answer, so I'm going to put you on the spot. If this group were put together and we're looking to have something on the ballot in November of 2018, when do they have to get that to you?
Well, obviously, the sooner the better. You can introduce legislation all the way up until May, but the sooner you get into the legislative cycle with legislation, because legislation is always tweaked And as it's tweaked, it's going through the committee process and, you know, negotiating and bargaining with the Senate and the House and administration. You know, that takes time, sometimes months. So I think there's a timeline where you can introduce new legislation up until February, and then there's a Rule 7D that allows you to introduce new legislation after. And if it has to do with cities and towns, it can be introduced at any time without going through the Rule 7D of the House. But I think the sooner that we understand what we want to do or not want to do or tweak or whatever we have to tweak, you know, there's conversations that need to be had. You know, there's conversations with RIDE, there's conversations with the two towns, with the school committee, with the public at large, that this is what we're looking to do, this is why we want to do it. So that's why I say, you know, every day that goes by is another day that we lose to be working on this. And don't get me wrong, I recognize that we all have day jobs and we all have jobs to do in our individual communities as well as here at the school committee level. And I'm on recess, so you know, I have a little extra time. But I recognize the fact that this is outside of your normal boundaries of responsibility, but it's equally important, if not more important, than all the other responsibilities that we have. We recognize, or I recognize, but while I was on the council, we all recognize the fact that our education system is the biggest financial component of both towns. But as such, it also is the most important to our future of what your product comes out of here and how well it is developed here for people that are looking to live here and grow businesses here. That's why Bristol and Warren is doing as well as it's doing. The school department has a place there in a major component of that success. So to answer, I think I answered your question, Paul. I mean, we have until February to introduce new legislation, but cities and towns can be introduced at any time. But the sooner that we get working on it, I think the better off we'll be in getting it passed or getting on the ballot.
Well, what I envision is something that would have to be on a ballot, not just legislative approval. Our enabling legislation requires changes to be approved by the voters, the electorate, not by the, no offense to the senior citizen, but not by where you are. But I want to push a little further if I can, because and the last time a task force of this nature was developed, it included people from those three bodies and people appointed by those three bodies. I'm assuming, and I know I'm not supposed to, that that's the vision you have of this as well. That task force was made up of 9 people. If I'm not mistaken, it was a council member from each community, the town administrator, and I think the town manager from the other community, a member of the public from each community, 2 members of the school committee or their designees, and the superintendent. I believe that's the way that task force was made up. But you know, you said you have notes and whatnot, but is that how you envision this thing being made up, so there's equal input, so to speak, from all 3 bodies?
Yeah, yes.
Personally, I don't have an issue with that, and my issue, quite honestly, is listening to the things you're saying, and I don't disagree with them, and I haven't heard any of my colleagues voice a disagreement. The issue I have is the time is of the essence. This is the 15th, the joint meeting's the 29th. We are not a town council. That meeting is not our meeting. We can't take action at that meeting, but we can take action at this meeting. And we can, if it's what you're looking for, because I'm not 100% sure, but I'm trying to get there, is for this body to take some action and request that a task force of that nature be set up with this makeup. I would strongly urge one of my colleagues to make a motion that we approve a setup of a task force that's made up of that nature for the purposes that you're talking about.
So moved.
Thank you, Brian.
You asked for it.
I have a motion and a second, but before I go any way to discussion, is that something, what you're looking for, something of that nature to be set up and initiated so that way it can go to the next step, to the next two bodies, and they, you know, everybody's buying in, we can then formulate from there and set up a meeting? Is that what you're...
That is, I'm looking to my chairman and Warren, and possibly my chairman Bristol here. You want to speak, Joe?
I would like to.
Okay. No, I don't have any issue, I'm just, you know, just looking to get it going.
I think that this is a good effort. I think that Ken has brought the issue that has historically been there, 14 years
At least.
that we discussed this. I'm concerned about the timeline. I do not feel that it is any way realistic to look at something that's been in place for 30 years and try to get an outcome before the end of this legislative session. I was thinking that this could even take a year. When you look at the charter review process, you have an elected body, which is elected. I think the makeup of the two towns could make that difficult, so I think appointed is okay. But when you go into something like this, you should be not looking at it as a sprint. It's a marathon. You need to understand that what we're looking at may not be revisited, so you want to get it right. You have to separate yourself from the current issues that you may think is what brought you here, but it has actually nothing to do with it. Paul and I, as well as Mr. Marshall when he was on the council, and Ms. Perella, would sit and discuss. It almost went nowhere, but it wasn't a negative. The fact that the enabling legislation had never been reviewed. Our charters have a review process. This enabling legislation didn't. So to sit here and listen to the possibility of getting together, figuring out what the ideas are, IDing the ideas, creating a policy, bringing it to the voters, not the way I would support this initiative. I like the fact that we're having this discussion. I feel that the two towns, in cooperation with what we're hearing tonight, will figure out what it is we need to do to send the resolution to Rep. Marshall, who is more than eager and has shown his willingness to help us facilitate. But we need to make sure that we, number one, have identified what it is we're actually trying to look at. Number two, if it's something that can be done by outside, if it can be by a firm, if it should be a cooperative effort between the committee as well as a firm. I don't think that we should make the leap to think that whatever we're going to get, we're going to be able to have it. I think and Nathan, you may remember better, Mary probably, and you, probably by August, it's already too late to get anything on the ballot. So if you think about the calendar, we're talking about hopefully getting legislation to create the committee in which we're actually trying to then get an outcome from. No, I'm sorry. You're looking, the councils will be putting the idea forward. Out of that body, then the outcome of that committee would be going to the legislation. They need to study the enabling legislation. They need to interview people. They need to participate in a process, not create something within a 9-month window. That's the only concern I have, is that we rush into something without realizing this hasn't been looked at other than the one last task force for 30 years. So I think that that is probably a real important aspect to this, not getting something to the state for, you know, the election or the ballot in 2018. If it happens that way, fine, but I really don't see how that could happen. That's all I have to say.
I don't want you to misinterpret what I was asking. Okay? I was asking a question as to a deadline for that ballot, so that there'd be a realistic deadline to give a task force that if it can be done by that date, then it makes that ballot. There's no intent for all we know, even with the process the way you're talking, it could happen. We just don't want to force it to happen. But my concern is, if you say we don't need it for another year and 9 months, nobody's going to do anything about it for the next year. So I want to have a goal of having it ready for the next, not this November, but the November afterwards. So it may not be an achievable goal, but you know, we used to, at least when I was younger, parents used to tell their children that anyone could grow up to be president, they could have that goal. Today they say you don't want to be president, so it's a totally different goal. But I'd still like to have a goal that we can reach for that won't make people idle. And that's the concern. My other concern, it's only mine, and I haven't had this conversation here, Joe, is the only issue I have with the scenario you put there as well is that I watched and participated in the last process. Suggestions came from there. And because the thought process is, or was, that the only way to get something on a ballot is to go through not the school committee, but 2 town councils to get it there, nothing happened. Because they couldn't agree on which one should work. My belief is if we're going to establish a task force, that task force should be given the charge to develop the appropriate changes that need to be implemented to make the system sustainable going forward and more palatable to the community, and that there's already going to be input from the 3 bodies if they exist on that task force. And it should go from the task force to the legislature for the public to vote at that point. And let the electors that elect you and elect me and elect them all have their say, instead of saying we're going to have 2 more channels before it gets there. Because last time those 2 channels had dams on them and nothing to buy it.
If I could respond, I think that that is a good feeling to hold. I also think that it would be beholden on the 2 bodies, the 2 councils, to hear that position and also figure out how we put that forward. I don't think it should be open-ended. I don't think it should be death by committee either. I don't think that anyone entering into this process should look at it as an opportunity to do nothing and install something and kill it. I think that if the 2 councils understand the seriousness of our intention, that we will come up with the proper wording to make sure that something just doesn't wither and die, or that ideas come forward and are ignored. I do think that the reason we're here today is because Rep. Marshall